we need to know what happened. We can't keep going on this. It didn't, she was alive when I left. We know that's not true, and there's nothing we can do about changing that. If we know she wasn't alive when you left this morning, there's got to be an explanation. Now is the time to tell us. Now is the time to get this out in the open.
Starting your day without coffee is tough, but beginning it by discovering the bodies of a mother and her 2 children is beyond horrifying. Detective Barlow's day began with a silent house, a dim room, and the horrifying discovery of a family's worst nightmare. On the morning of May 5th, 2009, around 6:43 a.m., Detective Barlow was still groggy, preparing for work. When his phone rang unexpectedly, he picked up and saw that the caller was his neighbor, Chris Coleman, the security manager at Joyce Meyer Ministries. From the very first moment, Barlow felt something was off. His neighbor, who'd been receiving threats to his life and family, was calling him at such an early hour. There had to be something serious going on. But what was the worst that could happen? Maybe just another threatening message? Barlow answered the phone, and Chris explained that he had been trying to reach his wife to wake the kids for school, but she wasn't answering any calls or texts. Detective Barlow asked Chris where he was, and Chris replied that he'd just finished at the gym and was near the bridge. Barlow told Chris that he'd head to his house immediately to check on his family, then hung up. As Barlow reviewed the call details, he realized that the bridge Chris mentioned was about 7 minutes from his home. This meant that in less than 7 minutes, he should be in front of Chris's house, hoping to prevent any harm to Chris's family. He knew Chris to be a devoted Christian husband and a loving father, the kind of man who'd protect his family at all costs. Or so Detective Barlow thought. Quickly preparing himself, Detective Barlow called the Columbia Police Department for backup and headed toward Chris's home. He arrived after those 7 minutes, only to find that Chris was still not there. How could a husband like Chris not rush home with everything he had to be there in a situation like this? But Detective Barlow's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Officer Dungan, responding to his call for backup. They rang the doorbell several times, but no one answered. Moving to the back of the house, Dungan noticed an open window. He informed Barlow, who was still at the front, about the open window. After announcing themselves as police and receiving no response, they entered through the window. Finding no one in the basement, they climbed the stairs and discovered red graffiti scrawled across the walls near the kitchen, filled with disturbing words like, "I'm always watching you." Just then, Dungan and Barlow heard the garage door opening. Chris had finally arrived at the house, but why hadn't he come through the front door? Why did he go through the garage, following the same route Detective Barlow had taken? This behavior struck Detective Barlow as odd. Officer Barlow told Chris to wait outside. Meanwhile, Officer Patton arrived at the scene. Patton entered the house to help Barlow and Dungan search. They found no one on the first floor, so they headed upstairs. Reaching the top of the stairs, Dungan glanced into a bedroom on the left, where he saw a white woman lying naked and face down on the bed. He tried to check her pulse, but found none. Noting her skin felt thick and rigid. As he attempted to move her body, he noticed her head, shoulder, and arm moved together as if they were fixed. Her chest was marked with a deep purple-red bruise, evidence of something sinister. Dungan then moved to the next room, where he found a child, about 9 years old, lifeless in his bed. Strange, circular patterns adorned the room, and paint streaked the child's hand and arm. The skin around his eyes and mouth appeared purple or blue. The neck felt thick and rigid, just like his mother's, and his skin showed shades of yellow and red. Detective Barlow also found the body of an 11-year-old boy, displaying the same discoloration and thickness in his skin as the other two. But what stood out was the message scrawled in red paint on the bed covers. Detective Justin Barlow, who had spent over 20 years investigating traffic accidents and knew that freshly deceased bodies don't show signs of rigor mortis this soon, felt a chill settle over him. He knew something truly terrifying was happening here. Detective Barlow went outside to speak with Chris, who was still waiting. In a somber voice, he informed him that his family hadn't survived. But Chris's reaction was completely unexpected. Although he began to cry, he didn't ask how his family had died, nor did he ask to see them. Detective Barlow felt that the person standing before him was either experiencing a shock unlike any he'd ever witnessed, or he was the real killer. But who was Chris Coleman? Who was his wife? And what did these children do to deserve this fate? This is what we'll uncover today in the horrifying story of the murders of Sherry Coleman, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman. Chris Coleman, born on March 20th, 1977, was the son of two pastors, Connie and Ron. From a young age, he was known for his good character and sense of responsibility. often participating in church activities. Violence wasn't in his nature at all. He even refused to join his father on hunting trips. But after high school, a recruiter visited him and suggested that with his strong physique, he could have a promising future in the Marines. But how could Chris, who hated violence, become a soldier in one of America's most formidable forces? After careful consideration, Chris applied to join the Marines as a dog handler, believing this would let him be part of the military without facing violence directly. During a meeting at a canine training center, 22-year-old Chris met 21-year-old Sherry Weiss, a member of the Air Force's military police. For Chris, his relationship with Sherry wasn't a profound love affair, but it was stable. They were both religious and shared similar values. Chris thought that would be enough. Amid the tough days of military life, his encounters with Sherry often grew intense, leading to unprotected intimacy. This closeness would eventually cost both Chris and Sherry. Their intimate relationship continued for 3 months, just enough time for a part of Chris to start growing inside Sherry. Chris took Sherry to meet his family, introducing her to his parents, but his mother's reaction stunned them both. Connie didn't see anything special in Sherry, calling her just another blonde girl. Noticing his family's lack of warmth toward Sherry, Chris informed them that he and Sherry planned a trip to Chicago and would leave the next day. But the following morning, Connie and Ron received a call from Chris. He hadn't gone to Chicago. He had married Sherry. The sudden decision baffled his parents, but Chris later explained it. Sherry was pregnant, and he felt obligated to marry her. The two pastors had little to say after hearing Chris's reason. Ron, wanting to support his son, offered him an alternative. He suggested Chris leave the Marines and take a security position at Joyce Meyer Ministries, a place familiar to the family that could provide financial support. Chris accepted and joined the Joyce Meyer Ministries as a security officer, building a career with the skills he'd acquired in the Marines. Sherry would eventually join him there too. The couple moved to a quiet neighborhood in Columbia, Illinois, supported by the generous salaries from their roles at Joyce Meyer Ministries. Life continued, and Chris and Sherry had 2 sons, Garrett and Gavin Coleman. Chris, ever disciplined, quickly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming the head of security and Joyce Meyer's personal bodyguard. With each promotion, his salary grew, securing a stable life for the family. Sherry, now a full-time mom, stayed home to care for their boys, leaving Chris as the family's sole provider. They seemed like the perfect family, a devoted couple with 2 angelic children who were adored in the neighborhood. Their laughter and kindness became a staple, and people admired their closeness. But what appeared to everyone else as a beautiful American family living the American dream was for Chris a nightmare. Chris felt he'd married Sherry too soon, and that the children had burdened him with responsibilities he hadn't chosen. Now, he decided it was time to punish every member of his family for choices he made purely out of religious conviction and inexperience. But what more could Sherry have done to support him? She gave him 2 sons, admired by everyone, and devoted herself to caring for them. What had she done to deserve this fate? Sherry couldn't ignore Chris's behavior, his constant message that he no longer loved her and felt burdened by their relationship was painfully clear. As a devoted wife and mother with strong religious beliefs, she tried everything to hold her marriage together. Her goal was simple: to make their home a place of comfort and safety for their family. But Chris, who was now earning over $100,000 a year, seemed blind to everything Sherry did for him. Instead, he began punishing her emotionally. He offered no support, and their intimate moments were rare, almost non-existent. In fact, Sherry once confided to a friend that she'd finally shared a rare, intimate moment with Chris, only for him to tell her immediately afterward not to assume it meant he still loved her. What kind of man says that to any woman, let alone his own wife? Chris did everything in his power to make Sherry resent their life together, hoping she'd ask for a divorce. For him, divorce would signal the end of his career. At Joyce Meyer Ministries, divorces among employees were unacceptable unless there was a compelling reason, and as far as anyone knew, there was no such reason in the Coleman household. Chris's internal conflict stretched on, and by early November 2008, the strain was overwhelming. He traveled to Florida on a work trip while Sherry called her close friend Tara, encouraging her to attend the Joyce Meyer conference and, perhaps, reconnect with Chris as well. But Sherry had no idea that this moment would change her life forever. Around this time, death threats began reaching Chris. Their relationship grew increasingly strained, and Chris's once subtle hints about his feelings turned into clear statements. Even at work, people started noticing unexplainable questions surrounding Chris. But who was Tara, the woman who would ultimately drive the final wedge between Chris and Sherry? Tara Lintz was Sherry's close high school friend who worked as a cocktail waitress at a poker room in St. Petersburg. Tara had always been part of Sherry's circle, but she was Sherry's opposite in many ways: wild, charismatic, and well aware of how to captivate anyone around her. Tara knew what men wanted, and she only let in those she chose. Her relationships were no strangers to blurred lines. Most men couldn't help but be drawn to her. In one instance, Chris's own brother struck up a conversation with Tara that quickly turned flirtatious, even leading him to send her revealing photos of himself. Sherry's brother had once even proposed to her. All these seemingly small details paint a picture of a woman who, knowingly or unknowingly, would go on to bring an entire family to ruin. The timing of the relationship between Tara and Chris couldn't have been more perfect for both of them. Tara, with her wild streak and the knowledge of how to make a man happy, and Chris, who felt he'd found a fresh chance to start a life with someone he truly loved. The two became deeply involved. Their phone calls were nearly constant, private videos were exchanged daily, and nude photos were a regular feature on each other's phones. Chris meticulously recorded every detail about Tara on his personal device. He noted her likes and dislikes, important dates in her life, and even her clothing sizes, right down to her underwear size. For Tara, building a life with a financially stable man like Chris was worth the risk, even if it meant betraying her closest friend. Together, they planned for Chris to divorce Sherry so they could start their life together. They even bought promise rings to solidify their future. They had already picked a name for their first daughter, Zoe Lynn Coleman. But there was one small issue Tara didn't know about. For Chris to get everything he wanted, Sherry would need to be the one to file for divorce. Of course, Chris wouldn't dare risk his relationship with Tara by explaining this obstacle. Instead, he decided to end things his way, cutting not just his ties with Sherry, but everything that bound them together. Despite Sherry's determination to keep their marriage intact, even after learning of Chris and Tara's affair, she wouldn't give up. Sherry was so resigned to her situation that she openly told a friend during a visit, "Would you like to see the woman my husband is having an affair with?" Chris felt his career slipping through his fingers. If Sherry openly accused him of an affair with Tara, everything he'd built would come crashing down. So he devised a two-part plan. First, he started telling everyone that his relationship with Sherry was unbearable, painting her as controlling and manipulative. Second, he began sending himself anonymous threats from a fake account on his work laptop. If he failed to convince people that life with Sherry was intolerable, he could rely on a killer to eliminate his family. On November 14th, he began emailing threats to himself from his work laptop using the email address destroychris@gmail.com. The threats demanded he quit his job at Joyce Meyer Ministries or face his family's murder. Chris informed the police about the threats, and Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow, who was Chris's neighbor, took on the case. Initially, Detective Barlow didn't put much weight on the threat emails, and he had a few logical reasons for this. First, Chris was the only recipient of the emails, despite not being Joyce Meyer's sole bodyguard. Second, the language in the emails didn't match typical threatening communications. Chris began all of his own emails with swearing, which didn't fit the style of a true criminal's threats. Third, there were spelling errors in the emails, such as substituting "you" for "o" in the word opportunity, giving the impression of a hasty author. When Chris realized his threat emails hadn't caused the reaction he wanted, he wrote a letter, placed it in his mailbox, and later had Sherry find it. and informed the police. In response, Detective Barlow set up a camera aimed directly at the mailbox, ready for any further threats. But once the camera was installed, the threatening messages abruptly stopped. Meanwhile, at Joyce Meyer Ministries, Chris's behavior was beginning to raise questions. The first hint came from his unusually high work phone bill. A closer look revealed a high number of calls between Chris's phone and another number in Florida. When Joyce Meyer's son, who served as director of operations, confronted Chris about the report, his main concern wasn't the cost. It was the suspicion that Chris might be involved with someone other than his wife. Chris, however, covered himself by saying the number belonged to one of Sherry's relatives and that she was aware of the calls. Joyce Meyer herself had also noticed Chris's behavior changes, including his sudden, frequent requests for time off, a departure from his usual pattern. When she tried to find out if everything was all right in his marriage, Chris seized the chance to tell her how unbearable Sherry had become. Seeing the strain, Joyce suggested Chris and Sherry attend marriage counseling sessions through the ministry. Chris agreed, and in the sessions, he pretended they were getting along better. But once they got home, he would revert to the resentful husband, filled with contempt for Sherry and the life he felt trapped in. During this period, Chris claimed he received around 4 threatening emails or so, he told those around him. But a pressing question arises. Could the IT department at Joyce Meyer Ministries have proven that these emails were being sent from within the company? As a systems engineer myself, I believe that with just 5 minutes of effort, the IT team could have unraveled Chris's entire plan. Each company has a unique IP address that employees use when accessing the internet. Since this IP is known to the IT department, they could have opened any threatening email, traced the IP, and discovered it originated from within the company. This would have allowed them to investigate further and identify the sender, but that never happened, and Chris continued to create his story of a potential killer, planning to sever all ties with his former life from Sherry to their children. Meanwhile, Chris was telling Tara that he was already preparing divorce papers with his lawyer. However, on May 4th, he told her that after receiving the papers, he discovered an error in Sherry's name and had asked his lawyer to correct it. May 4th, 2009, the day before the murder, was when Chris put the final touches on his plan. He played with his children outside their home, painting the picture of a loving father to distract everyone from the horror he was about to unleash. On May 5th, 2009, around 3 a.m., Chris Coleman strangled Sherry Coleman with a rope, stripping her of her clothes. But she did not die without a fight. She left defensive wounds on his forearms, a silent message to the world of the crime committed by a man determined to take everything. He then moved to Garrett and Gavin's room and strangled the children. The little angels didn't stand a chance. Afterward, he scrawled obscene words on the bed sheets and painted offensive words on the walls with red spray paint. He meticulously cleaned himself of any paint traces before leaving the house at exactly 5:43 a.m. and headed to the gym. About half an hour later, he began calling Sherry and texting her, urging her to wake up and get the kids ready. At precisely 6:43 a.m., he called Detective Justin Barlow, telling him he was worried about his wife, who wasn't answering his calls, and feared the person who had been threatening him might have carried out the threats. When Detective Barlow asked for his location, Chris replied that he was near the bridge, roughly 7 minutes from home. Chris ended the call and waited around 5 minutes, giving Detective Barlow time to arrive at the house and discover the bodies first. This would ensure that Chris appeared after the tragedy had been uncovered. But Chris, who thought he was smarter than everyone, overlooked a few crucial details that wouldn't escape seasoned Detective Barlow. First, Mr. Chris, you didn't use the front door, despite having the key. Instead, you entered along the path you'd set up for the police. Second, you didn't ask how your children died. Third, you didn't even request to see them. And most importantly, the bodies of your wife and children were already showing signs of rigor mortis, which means they couldn't have been killed between 5:42 and 7 a.m. With all these questions swirling in his mind, Detective Barlow stood in front of Chris as he wept. He asked Chris to get into the ambulance for any emergency, then called the police. requesting a chaplain to support Chris in this moment. Pastor Jonathan Peters arrived after about 25 minutes, but by that time, Chris had calmed down. Pastor Peters noted that Chris showed no signs of shock. At the police's request, Pastor Peters accompanied Chris in the ambulance. At one point, he noticed fresh scratches on Chris's arm and asked about them. Chris claimed he didn't know how he got them. Then, in a surprising move, Chris deliberately banged his right hand against the ambulance stretcher, seemingly to create an explanation for the scratches, if anyone asked later. When Chris was taken to the police station, the quiet neighborhood was shaken. The flashing lights of police cars and the bustle of officers and forensic teams nearly obscured the peaceful house's facade. As every neighbor looked out toward Chris Coleman's home, where the police had gathered, messages were still arriving on Sherry's phone to see if she and kids were okay. Sherry was beloved by all, and Garrett and Gavin were cherished symbols of the peaceful neighborhood. At 11 a.m., the bodies of Sherry and her children were taken to the medical examiner's office for autopsy to determine the cause of death. The detectives at the station prepared to question Chris Coleman, hoping he'd confess. All initial evidence pointed to him. If he wasn't the killer, he certainly knew who was. If he didn't confess, they'd need clear answers to several critical questions. What was Chris's motive for committing this crime? Were the threatening emails he received truly linked to the case? Did the handwriting in the graffiti match Chris's own? Was there any paint residue on his hands or body? But for the detectives, only the first question. They can look for its answer if Chris refused to confess. The others would require forensic experts. The detectives began questioning Chris about any problems he might have had with Sherry, but he denied it. When asked about Tara, he claimed they only exchanged text messages and tried to downplay their relationship, insisting it wasn't an affair. Throughout the interrogation, Chris attempted to appear cooperative and eager to help. He even agreed to provide a handwriting sample for the experts to analyze, confident that they wouldn't be able to match it to the graffiti on the walls. He thought that by using a different style of writing on the walls, he'd avoided detection, or so he believed. During questioning, Chris claimed he was feeling cold and asked for a blanket, which the detectives provided. When they questioned him about the scratches on his arm, he explained they were from accidentally hitting his arm in the ambulance, and he tried to keep his arms covered with the blanket. Chris, who thought he was outsmarting everyone, forgot that the entire interrogation was recorded. At one point, when the detective briefly left the room, Chris even leaned over to peek at the detective's notes. While Chris was being interrogated, the Columbia police had already reached out to authorities in St. Petersburg to question Tara. During her interview, Tara revealed everything about their relationship, contradicting all of Chris's claims. While the interrogation continues for Tara, Chris had completed 5 hours of questioning when he left the station and called Tara, who informed him she was also being questioned. Chris's response was a casual, "Well, that's interesting." With this information, the detectives had finally found their motive, Chris's affair with Tara. Yet 3 crucial questions still needed answers. Were the threatening emails he received truly linked to the case? Did the handwriting in the graffiti match Chris's own? Was there any paint residue on his hands or body? As for paint residue, although Chris managed to clean himself thoroughly, forensic scientist Adrian Beckel identified microscopic paint fragments from the crime scene taken from a picture frame on wall in the Coleman home contained traces of apple red paint. Beckel's analysis, with help from Rust-Oleum, confirmed that these fragments came from either Rust-Oleum's Painter's Touch or American Accents line. Further supporting this, former Rust-Oleum chemist Michael Harloff, who had over 33 years of experience, testified that the paint residue matched Rust-Oleum's apple red based on his visual comparisons. Columbia Police Detective Carla Hine also discovered a MasterCard in Chris Coleman's home. A subpoena revealed that a can of Rust-Oleum apple red Painter's Touch had been purchased with this card on February 9th, 2009 from a hardware store in St. Louis, approximately 7.5 miles from Chris's home. She obtained a copy of the receipt signed by Christopher E. Coleman. However, cans of red paint were found in Chris's home car. or any other property connected to him, Chris allowed the investigators to examine both his personal Apple laptop and his work-issued Dell laptop. What the detectives found was shocking. First, they uncovered a large number of intimate photos exchanged between Chris and Tara, exposing the depth of their relationship. The forensic experts traced the IP address used to send the threatening emails and discovered that they originated from none other than Chris's work laptop. Additionally, the forensic analysts noticed a peculiar detail: Chris's habit of misspelling the word opportunity in the exact same way as in the threatening emails. Curious, the experts searched for the word opportunity using Chris's unique misspelling and found it repeated over 43 times on his computer, confirming that he was indeed the sender of the threatening emails. Despite Chris's attempt to disguise his handwriting on the walls, the experts detected significant similarities between his usual writing style and the letters in the graffiti. The expert report concluded that the wall writings closely matched Chris's handwriting. One crucial detail remained: the exact time of the murders. Chris claimed that Sherry was alive when he left the house at 5:43 a.m., but this was proven false. The coroner's report indicated that the time of death was between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., a finding confirmed by renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Bodden, who was consulted by the court. After collecting all this evidence, Chris Coleman was arrested on May 19, 2009, and brought to trial. With all the evidence presented, the court found Chris Coleman guilty on May 5, 2011, exactly 2 years after the murder, sentencing him to 3 concurrent life terms without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. On the day of sentencing, under rainy skies, residents of the neighborhood gathered outside the courthouse, awaiting the judge's decision. When the guilty verdict was announced, relief and joy swept over the crowd as justice had finally been served. Since then, Chris has tried to appeal his conviction, but in 2020, his request for a retrial was denied and he remains in prison. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories. See you in the next video.